The Founder of Demonic Cultivation. An English translation by ㅤㅤㅤㅤ. Read by Luna Minerva. Chapter 34. Flora, Part 3. Involuntarily, Lan Sijue let the oil lamp slip from his fingers, but Wei Wuxian rescued it right before it crashed into the ground. Calmly, he swiped the fire talisman with his other hand and lit the lamp. Placing it on the table, he said, "Did you make all of these, ma'am? What craftsmanship!" Only then did everyone realize the people crowded inside the room weren't real humans, but a horde of paper effigies. The paper dolls' heads, faces, and bodies were about the same size as that of real humans and had been finely crafted. Some were men, some women, and some children. The men were all shadow guards, built to be large, sturdy, and strong, and to look so angry that their hair stood up, whereas the women were all beauties. Some had their hair up in twin buns, some in an elaborate single bun, and even though their paper garments were large and loose-fitting, their graceful bearing was clearly visible. The embroidery patterns on their attire were even finer than real embroidery. Some of the outfits were painted in vibrant reds and greens, while others were white like pale flowers from head to toe. 2 circles of rouge were smeared on every paper effigy's cheeks to represent living humans' rosy complexions. But the maker seemed not to have had the time to paint the effigy's irises and pupils, leaving their eyes a uniform white. The more garish the rouge, the more eerie the effigy appeared. The main room also had another table, on top of which were several candles of varying lengths. Wei Wuxian lit them one by one, and yellow light illuminated most of the room. Other than the paper effigies, 2 large wreaths were displayed on either side of the central room, and small mountains of paper gold ingots, paper pagodas, and hell money were piled in the corners. Jinling had already drawn his sword 1/3 of the way out of its scabbard. Upon realizing that this was only a shop for burial goods, he let out a barely perceptible sigh and slid his blade back into its sheath. Cultivators didn't use these popular trifles to mourn their dead, so the disciples rarely encountered this form of eerie ostentation. Since the burial goods were new to them, after they recovered from the initial fright, they grew curious, and their skin became covered in goosebumps. In any case, the goods were more exciting than ordinary monsters they night hunted. Regardless of how thick the fog was outside, it couldn't penetrate the room. As this was the first time the disciples were able to see each other's faces since they had entered Yi City, they were very relieved. Seeing that his charges had relaxed, Wei Wuxian turned to the old woman again. "May we perhaps borrow your kitchen?" The old woman seemed to dislike the firelight. Practically glaring at the oil lamp, she replied, "The kitchen is in the back. Go use it yourself." After she had finished speaking, she hid in another room as though avoiding the plague. The bang of the door as it shut was extremely loud, and some shivered upon hearing it. Jinling said, "There's something very weird about this old hag. You—" "All right, enough, stop it," Wei Wuxian said. "I need helpers. Who's coming with me?" "I'll come," Lan Sijue said quickly. Lan Jingyi was still standing as straight as a brush handle. "Then what'll I do?" "Keep standing," Wei Wuxian replied. "Don't move unless I say so." Lan Sijue followed Wei Wuxian to the kitchen in the back. Immediately upon entry, their noses were assaulted by a foul, moldy stench. Lan Sijue had never in his lifetime smelled anything quite so frightful. He began to feel faint, but he fought through it and didn't rush back out. Jinling had also followed them, but immediately upon entering the kitchen he leapt back. "What the hell is the smell?" he said, fanning himself as though his life depended upon it. "Why aren't you coming up with a way to cure the poison? What did you come here for?" What a nice coincidence. How did you know I was about to call you over? Come help me, Wei Wuxian said.
I'm not here to help. Who killed someone here and forgot to bury the body?
Princess Jinling, are you coming or not? If you are, then come inside and lend a hand. If you aren't, then return and sit by the others and tell someone else to come.
Who are you calling Princess Jinling?
Jinling said, furious.
You better watch what you say to me.
He pinched his nostrils shut and hesitated for quite some time.
I want to see what the hell you're gonna do.
He lifted the hem of his robe and stormed inside. Wei Wuxian opened a box with a thunk and discovered that the smell was emanating from within. A leg of pork and a chicken had been stuffed inside. The red part of the meat had turned green, and there were little white maggots curled up in it. The smell forced Jinling to back out of the room again, but Wei Wuxian lifted up the box and handed it to him. Better throw it away. You can toss it wherever as long as we don't smell it anymore. Though disgusted and full of doubt, Jinling did as he was told and threw the box out. He then produced a handkerchief and wiped his hands furiously, tossing it away when he was done. When he returned to the kitchen, he found that Wei Wuxian and Lan Sijue had actually filled 2 buckets of water from the well in the backyard and were in the middle of cleaning. "What are you doing?" Jinling said. "As you can see, we're wiping down the stove," Lan Sijue said, assiduously scrubbing as he spoke. "What's the point? It's not like we're gonna cook," Jinling said. "Who said we weren't?" Wei Wuxian replied. "Cooking is exactly what we're gonna do. Come dust the windowsill and get rid of all the cobwebs." He spoke with such righteousness and self-confidence that Jinling somehow found himself obeying. Muddle-headed and broom in hand, he started sweeping, but the longer he swept, the more he felt that something wasn't right. Just as he was about to throw the broom at Wei Wuxian's head, the latter opened another box. Startled, Jinling dashed outside. But fortunately, no rotten stench assaulted their nostrils this time. The 3 worked very quickly, and before long the kitchen looked as good as new. Finally, it looked fit for habitation, and not like some long-abandoned haunted room. The 3 piled some already chopped firewood that was sitting in the corner of the room under the stove, lit them with a flame talisman, and rested a large wok on top, which they had already wiped down. They boiled a pot of water, and Wei Wuxian poured out a mound of glutinous rice. He cleaned it and placed it into the wok. "We're making congee?" Jinling asked. "Mm-hmm," Wei Wuxian replied. Jinling hurled a cleaning rag downward. "Look at you, getting angry after working a little while. Now look at Sijue, he's worked very hard but hasn't uttered a word of complaint. What's wrong with congee?" "What's right about congee? It's so meager and bland. No, I'm not angry because there's something wrong with congee." "It's not for you anyway," Wei Wuxian said. "What?" Jinling said, even more furious. "I worked for so long and I don't even get any?" "Young Master Mo, can congee cure corpse poisoning?" Lan Sijue asked. "Yes, it can," Wei Wuxian said, smiling. "But the cure isn't the glutinous rice." "But the cure is the glutinous rice, not the congee itself. It's a traditional remedy. Typically, the rice is applied to the wound that the poison entered through. If you ever encounter this kind of situation again, you could try it. It'll be very painful, but it's definitely effective. You'll see results as soon as you use it. However, your companions weren't bitten or clawed, but swallowed the poison instead. So we can only make some congee out of the rice for them to eat." "No wonder you said we had to find a place with inhabitants, sir," Lan Sijue said immediately. "Only an inhabited building would have a kitchen and a store of glutinous rice." "Who knows how long the rice has been sitting here and if it's still edible," Jinling said. "No one's used this kitchen for at least a year. There's dust everywhere and the meat's gone rotten. Could that old woman have gone a whole year without eating? It's not like she can fast for ages like a monk, so how is she still alive?" Either no one's lived here the entire time and she isn't really the shop's proprietor, or she doesn't need to eat, Wei Wuxian said. If she doesn't need to eat, that would mean she's dead, Lan Sijue whispered. But she can clearly breathe. Wei Wuxian spoke while mixing ingredients from an assortment of bottles and jars into the congee with a spatula. Oh, right, yeah. You didn't finish telling me how you wound up here in E-City together. It can't be a coincidence that you ran into us, right? The two youths' faces immediately turned grave. Me, the land people, and the others were all chasing the same thing. I followed it from Qinghe, Jinling said. We followed it from Langya, Lan Sijue said. What was it? Wei Wuxian asked. Lan Sijue shook his head. We don't know. It never showed itself, so we have no idea who or what it is exactly, or who planned it. It turned out, having tricked his uncle and released Wei Wuxian several days ago, Jinling had been worried that Jiang Cheng would actually break his legs, so he had decided to sneak off and disappear, intending to reappear in front of his uncle only after Jiang Cheng's temper had cooled. After handing off Zidian to his uncle's trusted subordinate, Jinling immediately ran off, traveled to a little town on the edge of Qinghe to look for a place to night hunt, and went to a large inn to rest. That night, while he was memorizing spells, Xianzi, who had been laying by his side, shot up and ran to the door and began barking. At that point it was already late, so Jinling shouted at his dog to stop, but he then heard someone, or something, knocking on the door. Though Xianzi stopped barking, it appeared fretful and started clawing madly at the floor and growling. Alarmed, Jinling shouted for the person outside to identify themselves. He received no response, so he put it out of his mind. However, after an hour, the knocking started again. Jinling took Xianzi and escaped out the window. He circled around the inn and climbed up, planning to charge at whoever it was from behind and take them by surprise, so he could see exactly who was making such a disturbance in the middle of the night. But he was startled to find nothing but thin air. Quietly, he watched the front of his door for a while, but still no one appeared. He had Xianzi keep an eye out and guard the door, and prepared himself to strike as soon as someone approached. They did not rest the entire night, yet nothing happened. All they heard was a strange noise that sounded like dripping water. The next morning, a shriek came from outside, and Jinling kicked the door down, only for his foot to land in a pool of blood. Then something tumbled down from the top of the doorframe. Jinling only managed to avoid it by ducking backward. A black cat. Sometime during the night, someone had nailed the corpse of a cat above his door. The strange dripping sound he had heard was the sound of the cat's blood hitting the floor. I changed in so many times, but the same thing always happened, so I decided to get ahead of it and go after the culprit. Whenever I heard that something weird had happened and a cat corpse had appeared somewhere, I went to take a look. I had to figure out who was behind it. Wei Wuxian turned to Lan Sijue. You too? He nodded. Yes. A few days ago, we were night hunting in Langya. During dinner one night, we suddenly fished out a cat head from our soup, skin and all. In the beginning, we didn't know we were being targeted, but that night, after we switched inns, we found a cat corpse in one of our beds. The same thing happened for several days in a row. We followed whatever it was to Yueyang, ran into young Master Jin, and discovered that we were investigating the same thing. So we continued on together. Our investigation led us to this area only today. We asked a hunter from a village near Stone Steel a few questions, and he directed us to the road leading to E-City. A hunter? Wei Wuxian thought. The juniors should have arrived at the hamlet near the steel soon after him and Lan Wangji, but when the two had passed by, they hadn't seen any hunters. The shy women who had been feeding the chickens and watching the house were the only people present, and they had claimed that the men had left to transport goods and wouldn't come back for a long time. The longer Wei Wuxian thought about it, the more solemn his expression became. After he listened to the story, it became clear to him that the culprit hadn't done anything besides killing the cats and lobbing the corpses in the juniors' direction. Though the situation looked and sounded scary, they hadn't actually suffered any harm. Instead, it had piqued their curiosity and triggered a desire to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. On top of that, the juniors had run into each other at Yueyang, and Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji had also just come from Yueyang to Shudong. It looked very much as though someone had deliberately led this herd of clueless juniors over here so they could meet up with the two of them. Leading a pile of clueless juniors to a dangerous unknown location and putting them face to face with an extremely ferocious and deadly corpse limb, wasn't this the same route the culprit behind the mess at Moor Manor had taken? That wasn't even the most complicated aspect of the entire situation. Now, Wei Wuxian was quite worried about the Yin Tiger Tally. It could be in Yi City at that very moment. Though Wei Wuxian was loath to acknowledge this possibility, it was the most reasonable explanation for what had happened. After all, someone had been able to restore half of the Yin Tiger Tally. Even though others claimed this person had been eliminated, who knew in whose hand the restored Yin Tiger Tally could have landed? Right then, Lan Sijue was squatting on the floor, fanning the fire. He looked up at Wei Wuxian. "Senior Mo, the congee looks done." Pulled out of his reverie, Wei Wuxian stopped stirring the wok with a spatula, took the bowl Lan Sijue had just cleaned, and filled it with a spoonful of congee in order to give it a taste. "It's done. Why don't you take it out of the kitchen, give each of the poisoned ones a bowl, and feed it to them?" However, after they carried the pot of congee out and Lan Jingyi had a bite, he immediately spat it back out.
What is this? More poison?
"Poison?" Wei Wuxian said. "This is the cure! Glutinous rice congee."
Even ignoring why you're using glutinous rice as medicine, I've never eaten such spicy congee in my life.
The others who had tried some each nodded their head in turn, their eyes watering. Wei Wuxian rubbed his chin. He had grown up in Yunmeng, and the people of Yunmeng were very able to tolerate spice. Wei Wuxian's tastes leaned even spicier, so as long as he was the one cooking, the food he made was always so hot that even Jiang Cheng would throw the bowl away and complain about the taste. But nonetheless, he was never able to resist the urge to pile spoonfuls of spices into his dishes, and it seemed he couldn't control himself again this time. Out of curiosity, Lan Sijue took a bowl and tried a mouthful of congee. His face went red, and he pressed his lips firmly together to keep himself from spitting it back out. Even his eyes were turning scarlet. "This flavor... somehow it's so terrifyingly awful it feels familiar," he thought. "Every medicine causes side effects," Wei Wuxian said. "The heat will make you sweat, so you'll get better faster." Full of disbelief, all the youths made retching noises. They bore the pain and ate the whole bowl. After a while, their faces were red and sweat ran down their foreheads. Each felt as though suffering this torture was worse than death. "Is it really that bad?" Wei Wuxian couldn't help but say. "Han Guangjun's also from Guosu, but he likes spice just fine. So why are you guys like this?" Covering his mouth, Lan Sijue said, "But Han Guangjun's palate is light. He never eats spicy food." "Really?" Wei Wuxian said, startled. But he remembered that in his previous life, after he had defected from the Yunmeng Jiang clan, he had once met up with Lan Wangji in Yiling. At the time, though Wei Wuxian had been the subject of quite a bit of public castigation, it hadn't yet gotten to the point where everyone was calling for his head. Thus, he had steeled himself to appear in public and shared a meal with Lan Wangji, where they reminisced about the old days. Everything Lan Wangji had ordered was covered in red peppers and Sichuan peppercorn, So Wei Wuxian had always thought that Lan Wangji's preferences were similar to his. Thinking over it now, he didn't actually remember if Lan Wangji had lifted his chopsticks and actually eaten from any of the dishes. But he had even forgotten that he had asked Lan Wangji to dinner and had let him pay, so it was natural for him to forget such fine details. He didn't know why, but suddenly, he very, very much wanted to see Lan Wangji's face. Senior Mo! Senior Mo! Wei Wuxian's attention finally returned to the present. The old woman's door. It opened, Lan Sijue said. A black wind from some unknown location had blown the door to the old woman's small room open a crack. The door then closed again, then reopened. The inside of the room was black, and a vague, hunched silhouette could be seen by the table. Wei Wuxian indicated to the juniors not to move, then walked in alone. When the dim light from the main room spilled inside, the old woman's head was still lowered, and she seemed not to realize someone had entered the room. A piece of cloth laid over her knees, stretched across an embroidery frame. She appeared to be doing needlework. Her two hands were pressed together stiffly as she attempted to pass a thread through the eye of the needle. Wei Wuxian also sat by the table. Ma'am, why haven't you lit a light to help you thread the needle? Allow me. He took the thread and the needle, threaded the latter in one try, and handed it back to the old woman. Then, as though nothing had happened, he walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Don't go inside, he said. You just went in. Did you figure out whether that old hag is dead or alive? Jinling said. Don't call anyone a hag. That's very rude. The old woman is a living corpse. The juniors exchanged glances. A living corpse? Lan Sijue asked. A body that possesses all the characteristics of a corpse while still being alive. That's what a living corpse is, Wei Wuxian replied. You're saying she's still living? Jinling said, shocked. Did you guys see inside just now? Wei Wuxian asked. Yes. What did you see? What was she doing? Threading a needle. Did she succeed? No. Exactly. She couldn't get the string through. The dead's muscles go stiff, so she can't make complicated motions like those needed to thread a needle. The spots on her face aren't age spots. They're livor mortis. Though she doesn't have to eat, she can still breathe. So, she is still alive. But this elderly woman is very old. Many old women have poor eyesight and can't thread needles, Lan Sijue said. So I helped her thread it. But did you all notice something else? In the time since the door opened and I went inside, she hasn't blinked once. Each youth blinked a few times themselves. Living people blink in order to keep their eyes from stinging, but dead people have no need for it. On top of that, when I took the needle and thread, how did she look at me? Did anyone pay attention? Wei Wuxian said. She didn't move her eyes. Instead, she turned her whole head, Jinling said. Yes, exactly, Wei Wuxian replied. When ordinary people want to look in a different direction, they just need to move their eyes a bit. But dead people can't do that, because they're unable to perform such fine motions. They can only move their head and neck instead. Should we take notes? Lan Jingyi said dumbly. It's a good habit. But when you're night hunting, when will you have the time to look through a notebook? Learn it by heart. Walking corpses are bad enough. Why do these things exist? Jinling said, teeth clenched. Living corpses are very unlikely to appear naturally. Usually, they're man-made, just like this one is, Wei Wuxian said. Man-made? Why would anyone make one? Dead bodies have a lot of drawbacks. Their muscles are very stiff and they move very slowly, but there are also benefits. They don't feel pain, they can't think, and they're easily controlled. Someone thought they could fix the drawbacks and create perfect puppets. That's how living corpses came about. Though the crowd of youths didn't blurt anything out, that person must be Wei Wuxian, was written in giant characters on their face. Wei Wuxian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I never even made these kind of things. Though it sounded very much like his style. Fine. Wei Wuxian started the whole thing, Wei Wuxian said, sighing. But he only succeeded in forging Wen Ning, the ghost general. In reality, I've always wanted to know who came up with his name. It's so stupid. Anyway, some people want to copy him but fail, so they take unscrupulous shortcuts. Someone targeted the living instead of the dead and created these living corpse things, he summarized. A failed imitation. Upon hearing Wei Wuxian's name, Jinling's expression went cold. Wei Ying went down an unscrupulous path in the first place. Making living corpses and the like is a heresy even among heretics, Wei Wuxian said. Signement, what should we do now? Lan Sijue said. Some living corpses may not know they're already dead. This old woman doesn't seem to realize what happened, so it'll be fine, as long as we don't bother her for now. Just then, abruptly, the crisp, clear sound of the bamboo pole started again. The noise came from right next to one of the windows, but the black wooden slats covering the window were all closed. The faces of all the disciples inside the big room went pale. Ever since they had entered the city, they had been constantly harassed by this noise, so their expressions changed whenever they heard the sound. Wei Wuxian gestured for them to stay quiet. They held their breath and watched him go to the window and look outside through a small gap in the slats. When Wei Wuxian pressed his eye against the gap, he saw nothing but a field of white, so he initially thought the fog outside was too thick to see through. Who would have guessed that, in the blink of an eye, the field of white would suddenly back away? A pair of sinister white irises stared fiercely at him through the crack. The white that he had seen was not the blinding fog, but a pair of pupil-less eyes.